What's up, guys? This is Big Mike, Mike Sowell. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain. This is something that I've felt for a very long time, but I've been kind of hesitant to go here because Bill Russell is revered by many in basketball history. Okay, um, he's the ultimate winner. Uh, 11 championships in only 13 seasons. Um, and in our society, uh, as far as when it pertains to sports, championships have been increasingly seen as a measure of how successful your career was or is. It's not about your production, it's about, at the end of the day, championships. Now, don't get me wrong, I know players all say that their goal every year is to win a championship. Of course, of course. That's the ultimate team goal. But when we rate players individually, you cannot go on championships alone. It's stupid. It's stupid. Because one player can only do so much. If I was a borderline talent surrounded by all stars, and I happened to be on 12 championship teams somehow. I lucked up and always got traded to great teams, and I won 12 championships. I'd be on panels talking about, uh, my teammates and how, you know, different stories, But you never hear me talk about myself because I was only a so-so player or a borderline all-star playing with great players. Kenny Smith, but when you talk about but then you can compare him to a Charles Barkley, who was a great power forward. Uh, you can make the argument, all right. Charles Barkley, to me, I think he was the third greatest power forward of all time, behind Tim Duncan and Karl Malone. Had he take care of, have he took, did he, if he took care of his body more, uh, was he, if he was a little bit more dedicated to certain parts of the game, as far as conditioning, and if he had a little bit more luck as far as injuries are concerned, he could have been the greatest power forward of all time. I still think Barkley had the greatest peak, perhaps, for any power forward of all time. But anyway, people tend to look at Charles Barkley as incomplete. Well, he didn't win a championship. That's stupid. How many teams did Charles Barkley go on, played a part of that won 50 something games, that won 60 games, that went to the playoffs? That shows the effect that he had on his teams. Championships have become, to me, an overrated aspect of how great a player is. And let me go back to Bill Russell. Bill Russell was a tremendously talented NBA player. He was a very gifted athlete. I believe in 1956 he was one of the top 10 rated high jumpers in the world. This man was a tremendous athlete. There's video footage on YouTube. I believe on the channel name is Wilt Chamberlain Archives. A great channel. I'm subscribed to it as well. And you could see Bill Russell jumping over an NBA player for a layup, I believe it was. And people say in the 50s these guys weren't athletic. Are you insane? And Bill Russell was a tremendous, tremendous player. Probably the greatest defensive player of all time. And he has that legacy of 11 championships. But I have always been bothered personally when people compare him to Wilt Chamberlain and say that, well, look, Bill Russell was a better player because he won championships. And Wilt Chamberlain just could not win. Well, I think that is very, very erroneous. And I think that's a very simplistic way of looking at things. All right, let's do some comparisons right now between Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell. Number one, I think they're head-to-head matchups. I think now that I might be incorrect. Someone can uh, correct me in the comment section, but I think they're one-on-one matchups. Russell's teams won 88 games to Wilt Chamberlain's 74 games. His teams. That means that Bill Russell's teams won about 54% of their matchups. Chamberlain's 46%. That doesn't seem like an overly landslide proportion amount of wins for Russell and his teams. You know what I mean? Um, it has to be stated too that Bill Russell played with all stars and Hall of Famers. He played with a lot of talented players. He played with Bob Cousy. All right. He played with John Havlicek, who I think is the fourth greatest small forward of all time. He played with Tommy Heinsohn. He played with the individual who pretty much created the six-man role, Frank Ramsey. He played with K.C. Jones. He played with the great Sam Jones. He played with Tom Sanders. And there's some other players that don't come to mind right now that he played with that were good, if not great players. Bill Sharman. And it, he had a lot of talent around him. And the, Wilt, for the most part, he had some talented players, but that were on his team, Hal Greer. But a lot of the guys that were on his teams, they either were players who were developing or players who were near the end of their careers. Like, for instance, Paul Arizin, who had his best days in the 50s. By the time Wilt got there, Paul Arizin was in the decline of his career. Wilt's teams were just not quite as talented as the Boston Celtics, yet at the same time, because of Wilt's overall individual brilliance, many of those series with Boston went 6 and 7 games, with Boston winning by close margins, often by clutch shots by Sam Jones or Bill Russell or whatever. Um, like I said, I'm not trying to take anything away from Bill Russell. I just think that sometimes Wilt Chamberlain has been kind of shafted as far as why he didn't win more championships. Then there's this thing where people talk about, well, Bill Russell had this killer instinct, and Wilt Chamberlain was, this happy-go-lucky guy. He was very mellow. He just didn't have the killer instinct, and that's why. That's I used to hear. I think I've heard Skip Bayless say that. That's absolute bullshit. All right. Wilt Chamberlain's one of the most competitive individuals you will ever meet. There's a video on YouTube. There's a panel. I think it was a Golden State Warriors panel. And I think it was filmed back in November of 1999. You probably could find it on YouTube. There was different players who played with and against Wilt Chamberlain. It was a couple of months after he died, or it might have been a month after he died. And Al Attles talked about how competitive Wilt Chamberlain was. He would cheat you in cards. It reminds me of Michael Jordan. He was very competitive. At the same time, Wilt Chamberlain was very aware of how strong he was. Wilt Chamberlain could literally break a man's arm if he wanted to, if he tried to block his shot, if he tried to dunk over someone. It could really hurt you. Therefore, he tried to let up somewhat with certain things he did on the court. He could have played like Shaq, but he was even stronger than the Shaquille O'Neal. And we're talking about back in the 60s, all right? He didn't want to hurt people out there, but he did want to win badly. So I don't buy this. Wilt didn't want to win. He didn't have the competitive edge. That's bullshit. It's malarkey. Number, the third thing I want to point out to you is this extreme fallacy that uh, Russell shut down Wilt Chamberlain when they went 1-on-1. That's bullshit. In their head-to-head matchups, Russell uh, averaged about 23 points and about 14 rebounds. Chamberlain about 29 points and 29 rebounds. That's not shutting someone down. All right. Uh, Many times when they played against the Boston Celtics, Chamberlain had 40-point and 50-point games. In fact, on one game against the Boston Celtics, Chamberlain scored 62 points against Bill Russell. We all hear about the 100-point game that that Wilt Chamberlain had against the New York Knicks, March 2nd, 1962, in Hershey, Pennsylvania. Uh, what I think is probably maybe the second most impressive thing was the 55 rebound game that he had. And guess who he had it against? The Boston Celtics and Bill Russell. Whenever they matched up with one another, Bill Russell, who has the second highest rebounding average of all time, 22.5, he almost always was dominated on the boards by Wilt Chamberlain. So in conclusion, what my point of this video is that although Bill Russell had the more successful career as far as winning and championships, um, Bill Russell is not on the same level as a Wilt Chamberlain. And it's nothing to be ashamed of. He was not Wilt Chamberlain. Wilt Chamberlain is still, in my estimation, the most dominant player we've had in NBA history. I don't think he was the greatest. It's just my personal opinion. I think the greatest NBA player of all time was Michael Jordan. I know some people don't agree with that, but I think Michael Jordan's the greatest NBA player of all time. The greatest basketball player of all time, I think, as far as his resume, is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I think he just had a more well-rounded game than Wilt Chamberlain. He could shoot, a very good free throw shooter for a big man. He had the longer career. He pretty much, except for the last 2 years of his career, he was still a very effective player well into old age by basketball standards. And he just had a very successful career as far as accolades, achievements, individual and team. But Wilt Chamberlain, to me, was the most dominant player of all time, the third greatest player of all time, and the second greatest center of all time. Bill Russell was a great player, but I just think that sometimes he is a bit overrated. And I also want to say this before I go. I mentioned this one time in the comments section, and I believe this. I think one of the most underrated players of all time, as far as the center position, is Nate Thurmond. And I truly believe that if you switch Nate Thurmond with Bill Russell on those Boston Celtic teams, there was some, they weren't completely similar players, but there were some similarities. Nate Thurmond was a great defensive player, great screen setter, great shot blocker. Uh, he wasn't the greatest offensive player, but he could score. I think if you switch him with Bill Russell, Nate Thurmond will be looked at as a top 10 all-time player, and Bill Russell may be looked at as more of a top 25, top 30 player. I know some people might be pissed off at me saying that, but that's what I truly believe. I believe that championships have inflated Russell's legacy to an extent.